But we are here tonight in chapter 22, and it is a very full chapter, a lot of topics covered, and many of them are amazingly relevant to our day. It says there in verse 1, "You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray and hide yourself from them. You shall certainly bring them back to your brother. And if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall remain with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him. You shall do the same with his donkey, and so shall you do with his garment, or any lost thing of your brother's, which he has lost and you have found. You shall do likewise. You must not hide yourself. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him lift them up again." And so we're not just looking at horrific things that men can do to men in a sinful way, as we've looked at killing and hurting them and lying to them and all the things that man can do to man. But now we're not looking at that. We would say that's a sin of commission. We're now looking at the sin of omission. And that is not doing what you're supposed to do when you're supposed to do it. And when you really think about it, all sin, or if you were to see actual evil, it is in the omission. And so many would say that, for example, adultery, it's commission of doing something, but really it's an omission, the lack of purity. You say lying, that's a sin of commission, but really it's the sin of not telling the truth, which is omission, not telling the truth. And so if you just got out of the pool and you're drying yourself off and you see a little baby behind you fall into the pool, your neighbor's kid got through your fence somehow, and you're like, "Oh, I just got through drying off, and my favorite episode of Gilligan's coming on, and I am really hungry after swimming, and somebody else will find him and take care of it." And you go in your house later, you hear the ambulance show up, and sure enough, the baby's dead. And they ask you, "Wow, you had no indication?" "Oh, well, I saw it fall in. I just didn't really have the time to do anything about it." Well, what would everybody in the community think of you? You'd say, "Well, it wasn't like I got a broom and pushed the baby underwater and made it drown. I had other things to do. Don't you understand that? It's not my baby. It's not my responsibility." Well, I'll tell you, it would be seen as a horrible, horrible sin, wouldn't it? You would be excommunicated from that society, from simply not doing something when you should have done something. And so really that's what we're looking at here. And boy, today we are busy, aren't we? We are so busy. I would like to help the little old lady across the street, but somebody else is going to have to do it because I'm busy. Some single mom with 4 kids got a flat tire. Man, I would like to be the one to help, but I got to get to where I'm going. And so he is telling you here, really, it's the golden rule, isn't it? We don't have it here in Deuteronomy. We only have it in Exodus. But do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Yeah, question?
I was going to add, because in relation to 22:4, where it talks about your brother's donkey or ox falling down,
Yeah.
helping him get back on the road.
Yeah.
I've noticed in the last probably like 2 or 3 years, I see a lot of when people break down on the side, you don't really see people stopping to help anymore.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I push more cars than I can.
Yeah.
But I feel like you don't see anybody else stopping anymore.
Yeah.
And it's like, not really our job to help them, but it's part of our duty, like it's talking about here, to not see that and go, "Oh, well,
Yeah.
I can't spare 2 minutes to put this person in the parking lot."
And most of the commentators I read pointed to the last days, the love of man grows cold. men towards men. It's really, I've got the time to help you. I just don't care about you. I don't care enough about mankind to stop to help you, even if I had the time, even if I had the know-how. I just don't like people enough to want to stop. And it's a true indicator of the last days. We're going to have question and answer or comments at the end of the message. Great point, though. I appreciate that very much. And so we had in our society, we've had this saying, finders, what is it? Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. That's very pagan. And it's really the opposite of the Bible. We do not have finders, keepers. We have finders. We've got to work hard to get it back to the person whose it is. And I understand you can bend your mind and program yourself with that kind of doctrine, but it's not something that God will honor. So whatever windfall you think you're getting in the moment by finding, keeping, God won't honor that in the long run. And of course, really, I think the big example in the New Testament of all of this is the Good Samaritan story. Remember that? And here you got this Jewish guy that's beat up and knocked out and unconscious, and here comes the Levites, here comes the priests, the religious leaders, and they see their fellow Jewish brother going, if I get next to him and he dies, I'm defiled. I'll be unclean for a few days and have to go through the process, or I've got to get there. I'm going to be busy. I don't want to miss the festival, or whatever he's thinking. But a Samaritan. Now, if you know anything about the Jews and Samaritan, a Jew would definitely not stop to help a Samaritan. Not a chance. Because they hated the Samaritans for being half-breeds. But this Samaritan, knowing that it would not be reciprocated, did not care. But he nurtured that guy. Then he put him on his own donkey and had the donkey be pulled while the guy was on his own donkey, which is a sign of servanthood. The slave was on the ground walking the donkey, and the master was on. So he really reversed. And then we find out this guy is a somebody. He gets to the end, and he's got plenty of money. Hey, however long the guy's got to stay, I'll pay, and here's a bunch of money up front, and I'll pay the rest when I get back. And he was also in a hurry. He had to go. But a lot of out-of-pocket money to help this guy get back on his feet. He was busy. He was in a hurry. He was wealthy. He helped somebody that would never help him in a similar situation. None of that mattered. And this is the spirit in which we find ourselves, that we have to stop to help. And of course, I mentioned in Leviticus, the golden rule in Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So what would you want to happen if that was you who lost your wallet or your cell phone or your whatever it was, your donkey? You know, if your donkey, Fred, if somebody stole your donkey, you would want them to give it back to you, right? Yes, you'd hate to lose your donkey. And so this is what we find. Verse 5, a woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on women's garments, for all who do so are an abomination to God. By the way, the word abomination here is the same word used back in Leviticus when it talked about a man lying with another man as a woman, homosexuality. It's a abominable thing. And so the cross-dressing, the transgenderism, the transvestitism, and all the other words going on, it's as if you committed a homosexual act in God's mind. It's not this is sort of a gray area. No gray area here. Now, what we find when we look at a passage like this, and really all the Bible, but here In particular, we realize that we can't just read the scripture and get all that it's saying. We have to interpret the Bible. Do you understand that? And that's why if you don't interpret properly, you've heard people say you can make the Bible say anything. And it's true. You could make any document. You could make the newspaper say anything. You could make, Mark Twain's book say anything. I mean, you could do that with any literature. But you have to take it in context. And so when we interpret the Bible, and I've written it out here for you, what is the passage actually saying? We have to look at the context. We have to look at the context in which the text was presented. Secondly, we need to look at the historical context. What was the culture of the original hearers or the original readers? How does the original language affect the text? Now, sometimes we don't have that information. We don't have enough information about the culture. So we get verses in the Bible that meant something to the original readers, but nobody else will that ever help. For example, in 1 Corinthians, when he's talking about they didn't believe in the resurrection, and Paul says, if you don't believe in the resurrection, then why are you baptized for the dead? Do you remember that verse? Oh, the Mormons love it. It's one of their main doctrinal verses. But we say, culturally, historically, we have no information on this. But somewhere, somehow, in the Corinthians' knowledge, the first readers knew they were in their pagan religion. Some false teacher came into Christianity. For some reason, they were baptizing for the dead. Paul wasn't saying, that's a great thing. He was just saying it's in contradiction to their thought process of not believing in the resurrection. And why are you getting baptized for the dead if there's no resurrection? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that thing? So what do we do with that verse? Why then are you baptized for the dead? We can't do anything with it. We do not have a context. We do not have a historical context. We have to just say, God spoke to the Corinthians, the original readers. They understood it, and it was for them, but it's really not for anybody until some archaeologists dig something up to say otherwise. We really can't interpret that verse. Okay? We can't interpret it. We just have to let it lie. And so here we're looking at this passage about what is it, clearly there's men wearing something that's women and women wearing something men, and it's an abomination. So the next point is, number 3, in interpreting the Bible, what is the principle to be gained from the text? And then number 4, the biblical interpretation. Consider how this verse or topic is covered in other places in the Bible. We're looking at biblical interpretation. And then the application, with all the information studied, what does God's word say to us in our day and culture? And so I think you got to be careful jumping from a verse without interpreting it. Now, I grew up where pastors would tell the women, pantsuits are coming out. Matter of fact, this really did happen. I was 15 years old, and one of the deacon's wives wore a pantsuit. Now, to be honest with you, you couldn't really tell. It was big, baggy legs, and it looked like a dress, but I guess there was a split, and it was 2 legs. But I couldn't tell. It looked like a dress. It was this big, baggy thing. But boy, some of the ladies pointed it out, and immediately following the service, they had a board meeting whether they were going to have to kick that guy out of ministry because his wife wore a pantsuit to church. Well, this verse is the one they pulled out. Yep, right there. It's an abomination to wear pantsuits. Let you women know you can only have dresses at church because that's women and pants are for men. End of story. Well, does that verse say anything about pants? Does that verse say anything about dresses? It doesn't say anything. You know what's interesting? At this time and for thousands of years following this time, and even today in the Eastern culture, men and women both wore robes. Now, the only difference was men typically wore more utilitarian, rugged looking, more simple robes, and women usually had softer material and usually had colors or some kind of embroidery into it, something a little more decorative. But, you know, it wasn't some gigantic difference between the robes. And then, of course, you could say today in Scotland and in Ireland, where they wear kilts. Hey, that's feminine wearing a kilt. They'd probably knock your block off if you said that. But in reality, in that part of the world, and for hundreds of years, men wore kilts because nobody wore pants. They weren't invented. And then, of course, now today, women wearing pants in no way is masculine. Now, I will admit there are some masculine-looking pants, and I see some women who are butch women, who are lesbians, trying to, you know, the butch type of lesbian, trying to look manly, and they wear these more manly pants. And the purpose of wearing that manly cut-up pants is because they want to look more masculine. And I would say that that would apply to this verse. Now, when we look at other passages on this, it again shows us that they are interpreting the Bible in context of their culture. We find this, for example, in 1 Timothy 2, verse 9 and 10. In like manner also, the women adorn themselves in modest apparel. How are you going to define that? Modest apparel. It really depends, again, on the culture, doesn't it? With propriety, moderation. Now, notice here, the key thing about this, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Now, at this time in the Roman culture and other people mimicking the Roman culture as they were in charge, women would pay a lot of money to get blonde-haired wigs from, you know, the more eastern part of the world. They'd pay a lot of money for the blonde wigs, and they would put a clear wig on with blonde hair. The other thing in the Roman was blue hair. They had blue hair. And then they would braid into the blue or blonde hair very expensive jewels, whether it was pearls or sometimes diamonds. Sometimes they'd have hundreds of thousands of dollars of jewelry in their hair. And this is something they did. And so Paul is telling, as we get to 1 Timothy 6, he says there's a lot of wealthy people there at the church of Ephesus. And he actually, in chapter 6, has directions for wealthy people. So no doubt the wealthy Ephesians, copying the Roman culture, were doing some of these things. And at this point, he just says, you know, when it comes to dressing, when it comes to wearing clothes, it's really the women who need to understand that God likes modesty and God likes frugalness, so to speak. There's a moderation, he says, a propriety. Understand who you are and how you're living, and then moderation. You know, get the blonde wig if that's what you want to do, but don't put hundreds of thousands of dollars jewels. Put, you know, a few $100s. I don't know what he meant by this. Now, in 1 Peter 3, verse 3 and 4, he says, do not let your adornment be merely outward. Okay, now that's a good insight. Arranging of the hair, wearing of gold, putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be, here's the key, the hidden person of the heart, with an incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. And then, of course, in Proverbs 31:30, charm is deceitful, beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. So what we find is really there's nothing more about men and their clothing. It's more about women and their clothing. This is what we find in the Bible. So outside of this passage in Deuteronomy, And again, how do we interpret? It would be very cultural how you interpret it. And you say, well, since we can't really interpret it strongly, then what would we do? Well, this is what we find from the other passages. God is looking upon the heart. So it's not so much that you're wearing that clothing, but what is in your heart in wearing that clothing? Are you wearing that clothing to show your breast? Or some guy to show his muscles? And it's to a point where you're glorying in it. Don't let the strong man glory in his strength, or the rich man glory in his riches. Is that why you're wearing that? It's to get attention. God wants you to get his attention. Not with the outward adorning, because God is looking upon the heart. And he wants, and we have a whole list here. Modest apparel, propriety, moderation, good works, the hidden person of the heart, a beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. So we find that charm is deceitful and beauty is passing. You know, you see these beautiful teenage girls, 20-year-old girls, then they get in their 30s and things start falling apart quickly. And sometimes they do drastic things to try to look like they did in their 20s. And I have not seen success on that front yet. So the nips and the tucks, from my point of view, and only my point of view, is not working. The science has not caught up with the desire of what you're doing. But yet, in these rich circles, women looking very plastic is very acceptable. It's from outsiders looking in, it's like, whoa, I don't even recognize you. Yeah, you don't have the wrinkles under whatever anymore, but it doesn't look like you anymore. And you can't smile anymore. The hundreds different little micro expressions have been killed by the Botox or the cutting, and I can't, you know, you got a good poker face now. I guess play poker, take up Texas Hold'em or something. You know, so somebody the other day said, you know how you know E.T. is a feminist. Did you know how E.T. is a feminist? You know how we can know that? Because he looks like one. Anyway, I thought it was hilarious. Sorry, let's go back to the Bible here. Now, we do have another situation in 1 Corinthians 11, in verse 2 through 7, where Paul is addressing head coverings and women wearing head coverings, and that by nature, women having longer hair. Again, what does that mean? In this culture that Paul was speaking, they probably never cut their hair. So women's hair would be down to the floor almost, and then they curl it up and put it on top. And then, of course, men having long hair, what did that mean? You know, I don't think it means long hair like we think. It's probably, even if it were long in our cultural determination of things, probably wouldn't have been considered long in what Paul was talking about. But we're talking about very lengthy hair. And so he goes on to say in verse 2 through 7 that a woman, because of this, because if she has a real heart of submission to Christ, she needs to show that submission to her husband by, if she prays or she is visible in any way communicating in the church, she should have her head covered. Or it's not giving glory to Christ because it's showing that she's not submitted to her husband or Christ. Now, he's basically saying, if you're not going to cover your head, ladies, cut it off. Go bald. Boy, strong words. Is it basically says, is it wrong for you to, as a woman, to have your head bald? Then, in the same token, that's the way God sees it if you're praying without your head being covered. This was the culture of Paul's time, and he had a very strong opinion on it. But notice how he ends this discussion in 1 Corinthians 11:13. Judge among yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? And then he says in verse 16 of 1 Corinthians 11, but if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. So he tells you, I am communicating my very strong cultural opinions. And it's my opinion. In essence, he is saying. And so what do we do with these kind of passages? Just like in Deuteronomy, we step back and say, what is the interpretation of these things? And in 1 Corinthians 11, it's all about submission. It's not about drawing attention to yourself. It's offensive to God by not remaining under submission to Christ, who is submission to God the Father. So you have God the Father, you have the Son, and then man was made first. The woman was made second to be the helpmaker of the man. Paul talks about all this in 1 Corinthians 11. And so man is the head over the woman, like Christ is the head over man. And so therefore the woman, when it comes to church, she should have the heart of submission in the church service so Christ is glorified. That is the point. Now you say, is that a big point with us in our culture today? It really isn't. It isn't. I do think that where Paul later in Galatians says, there's neither man nor woman, or bond nor slave, Jew nor Gentile, we're all equal in one. I think that is where we're at. And there are people sometimes not submitted, and it really has nothing to do with heads covers or not. I knew one, actually Calvary Chapel, that become Calvinist, but anyway, they interpreted this passage, and the elders decided all the women needed to start wearing head coverings to church. They were no longer a Calvary Chapel by this point. Well, all was good and well with this concept, except for the pastor's wife. She hated it. And so she came with this little scarf. And they were going, I don't think that's really covering your head. And then she said, well, I can see some of your wife's hair. You can see some of my hair. How much of my hair has to be covered? Where's that in the Bible? Well, it's not in the Bible. And so the next week, she came literally with a little, you put your cup on a cup holder, and they have cloth cup holders. She had a little cup holder on her head. The pastor got fired because his wife wasn't in submission to her husband. But the point she made was very good, and the church had to stop trying to do the head coverings because of the point she made was, what does the Bible actually say about this? And if it's cultural, are we supposed to take a culture from 2,000 years ago, or a culture from the eastern part of the world, and apply it to our Western nice church in the 20th century at this point? And they finally said, okay, yeah, we got to talk about how do you interpret the scripture? And you see why that needs to happen. So what do we come with away here? Is that to God, you cannot confuse the genders, and it's really not about somebody policing it. In other words, Dennis isn't standing at the door going, yeah, a little feminine for you, Kirk. Go change shirts. No, Cheryl, those pants are a little on the men's side. Go home and put on more feminine pants. Then you can come back. No, the point is that it's about the heart towards God. What's going on in your heart? Are you being who God knitted you in your mother's womb? God knitted you to be a man. Are you being a man? Or God knitted you to be a woman. Are you being a woman? Now, I have traveled the world and I have seen cultures that have been infeminized. When we went into the Eastern Bloc countries after the Iron Curtain fell, The Soviets suppressed countries that they very much punished men for being men in the cultures. And so men learned to not stand out. And if in any aggression towards them, especially by a Russian overlord, they would immediately become very timid. So they didn't get the heat of the Roman soldier, get hit once or twice or kicked or knocked down. But because you're not showing any masculinity, they'll leave you alone and go to the next person. And it happened for so many decades that when we got there, men, honestly, the women were more men than the men. And it showed in the marriage. And it showed especially in raising kids. Because kids were not seeing men be men, and it was messing them up. And so when we went over there as Americans and our missionaries, and we're just these American guys being men, it was just so attractive. Not physically. I'm not saying, physically trying to hook up romantically. I'm just saying men immediately like, I'm liberated to be a man. But it was hard. It was not an easy thing. And women loved it, going, man, I finally can quit being the man because we have men. There'll be men. And it took a couple of decades, to be honest with you, to see a real change in the society. Well, you would think there's not a whole lot to say on verse 5, but in our day and age, there's a lot necessary to say on verse 5, isn't there? Well, verse 6 and 7. If a bird's nest, changing the subject totally, if the bird's nest happens to be before you along the way, in a tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, with the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall surely let the mother go and take the young for yourself, that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days. So, conservation. You will find that God is a conservationist. Do you remember what we just read shortly a few chapters back in chapter 20, verse 20? When they were besieging a city, and God said, if you have a tree that has fruit on it, you are not to cut it down. Because again, when you had siege against a city, once you're done conquering that city, you don't want to leave anything left. You want nothing but dirt because you had to fight, against your enemy. And God says, no, leave the fruit trees there for the future. And now he's basically saying, if you see a bird and sitting on the young, on the eggs, and you just like, man, there's a whole meal. I'll eat the mother, I'll eat the eggs, I'll eat the little ones, I'll make a big meal out of the whole family. God says, don't do that. You can have part of it, but you leave the mother alone to be able to make another nest and have more eggs and for the welfare. And he basically says this is what God can honor. Now, we have seen it, and I've seen it in third world countries where they kill anything that moves. We're seeing that right now with the immigrants from these other parts of the world that are not even third world. They're like 10th world. I don't know what you say. But these people that are coming in from Somalia and Sudan and these kind of things. I know down in London, these guys, anything that moves in these very nice parks right next to Buckingham Palace, they literally will kill every bird out of the trees. They have killed the Queen's geese that have been there for hundreds of years that are endangered species. They kill them and pluck them and cook them right there on a trash can with a trash cart. They get the trash cart and turn it upside down and use the lines in the trash cart on top of the trash can, and they'll just eat this geese right there in the park. No birds. Every bird, they get their slingshot. They kill them. There's nothing living. They don't eat. And of course, We know in Springfield, they eat the cats and they eat the dogs. And you can listen to the song about that if you want. And again, I don't know what these guys have been through. No doubt starvation situations. But there is a mentality of just, I want what I want right now, and I don't care about the future. And it's really not a trust in God for tomorrow, is it? And so he is saying there's got to be a conservationist attitude. There's got to be a mindset about the future. And so you can take some, but not all. And you're not to be greedy and taking because you can. There's the mother sitting on the eggs, and I could easily get it all for myself and have a full meal right now. Don't do it. And again, such animal cruelty type really could go into the animal cruelty category. It's not good for the mindset of a nation. It's a destructive thought, a pagan way of thinking. It's not a godly way of thinking. And so again, the original readers reading this, especially those who were slaves in Egypt for 400 years, they probably didn't have this conservationist type of mentality, did they? But Moses is saying, when you head into the promised land, there's a new way of thinking. Then in verse 8, he says, when you build a new house, then you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring guilt of bloodshed on your household if anyone falls from it. So in Egypt, they were probably living in shacks, right? They probably weren't living in fancy houses. And of course, now for 40 years in the desert, they've been living in tents. So they've really never built a house with a nice living room on the roof. In the Eastern world, it gets very hot there, and their roofs are their living rooms. They will stay a good portion upon there, especially in the evening. And if it's a hot night, they'll all sleep on the roof. And again, a third world type mentality says, we know where the edge is. My family's going to be fine without a parapet. A parapet is just a railing, if you would, around the rooftop. It can be a wall that's built. So you can come to the wall, but you just don't have a slab. And if you've been to third world countries, they don't have parapets. And you're amazed sometimes. And I'll tell you, we often have to stop when we take teenage kids to third world country and say, stop here. You need to understand they do not do things for the safety of people. I remember being in Peru, and we had the high school group with this, and we were going to get the kids from the neighborhood to come and play soccer in the park. And there's this park, big, beautiful grass area, and our kids kick the ball, and they start to run out, and all the Peruvians are stopped in shock. They're like, ah! And we're like, stop everybody! What's going on here? They said, you can't just run out in the middle of the green grass in the park. You got to investigate. And sure enough, there was holes in the middle of that grass with rebar in it. There were holes that would have broke your ankle. There was all kinds of glass bottles you would have stepped on and gotten hurt. And so we had to mark out a big area, and we had to, everybody hand to hand just had to go through it until we got everything that was safe and fill in holes or mark holes, put big garments around it or something to make sure everybody knew not to trip in the hole. When I was in Costa Rica, I lived there a little over a year, right across from the school. In the sidewalk, we're working in, I think, the water system or the sewage system. And they made a pretty good size hole, 4 feet by 4 feet, in the sidewalk to work on it. And when they were done, they walked away. The day before, it was sidewalk. Tonight, it's a big giant hole full of rebar. Just rebar. You look down in the hole, just rebar, two stories down. I don't know why. Well, the semester before we went to the language school there in San Jose in Costa Rica, The student walked right there, fell in that hole, was impelled, and died. Because they had no markers whatsoever. I can tell you many more stories, whether it's Eastern Europe or in Central and South America. They do not have the concept that I am my brother's keeper. So the big question, remember, God says, Cain, where is your brother? And he's like, is that my problem? Is that my responsibility? Am I responsible to keep tabs on where my brother might be and what he's doing? And we know the answer to that story, even though God didn't answer it there, because it was rhetorically obvious. Yes, we are our brother's keeper. And we need to live in such a way that we are helping our brother be safe. So he is saying here far more. It's like, okay, is God really concerned about parapets on roofs? Again, going back to Bible interpretation, is that really the most important thing to God? He's looking from heaven going, does everybody have a parapet? That parapet, it should be a little higher. Or is God making a principle of interpretation here, saying that we need to live in such a way that we affect people around us, but we are always doing something that is thinking about them and caring for them. Now, I would like to say something to you LA drivers. When somebody puts their blinker on to change lanes, that does not mean speed up and cut them off. It was very surprising when I moved up here. I don't put my blinker on anymore, just like everybody else. I put my blinker on, it's for sure I'll never get over. And people take it very personally. It's like, how dare you get in front of me? I'm trying to get off right there. I've got another mile, I've got to get off. I'm not trying to beat you in a race. We're all in it together. If I were to stop the whole 405 freeway, I'd say, let's all be a team. We're all in this together. Let's all get down the 405 freeway together. Let's all work together. And I think we need to drive in such a way that we are thinking about others and not ourselves. And of course, we know the verse of all verses on this topic, don't we? Philippians 2:4. Paul said it. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but what? Also for the interests of others. And of course, he also says there, he didn't put that verse in there, but see, everybody is more important than yourself. And put see their needs is more important than your own needs. Well, verse 9 through 11, I don't know if we're going to make it through the chapter here tonight. I didn't think we were. It's a very lengthy chapter. But in verse 9 through 11 here, you shall not sow your vineyard with different kinds of seed, lest the yield of the seed which you have sown on the fruit of your vineyard is defiled. Secondly, you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. 11, you shall not wear a garment of different sorts, such as wool and linen mixed together. And then verse 12, you shall make tassels on the four corners of the clothing which you are covered yourself. So we get this teaching on mixture. And again, we sort of wonder why. So the best that the commentators that I have read, it's had something to do with the paganism of that time. Somehow they were manipulating the vines to produce something that was not godly. Maybe it had a hallucinogenic in it. Maybe it had some kind of use in their pagan worship. But God is basically saying, do not tamper with the purity of the vine. And again, as we talked about this, it's probably not just the vine. It's including all, peach trees and fig trees and whatever. And then the next thing he says, don't make a mixture with an oxen and a donkey. So again, here he is saying, consider the mixture. Consider the ox and the nature of the ox. Consider the mule, the donkey, and the nature of the donkey. And trying to work them side by side together when they're so different, it's cruel. It's cruel to the ox, it's cruel to the donkey. They should have never been put as equals together in the pulling of the plow. And then the same with garments. You got the wool and you got the linen. And again, I think that the two big distinctions is the way they shrink. They shrink very differently, don't they? And so the rate of which they shrink, they would just shred each other. They would pull apart. And you would not have a very good outcome with a garment where you have the wool and the linen being put together. So you say, man, God from heaven is up there going, I got another command. I know, what are we at, 600? I'm going to give those 613 of those commands in. And on those 613 commands, I really want you to think about mixture. I would say all of this to some part has probably to do with paganism. And as they're heading into Canaan, you're not to be a part of their pagan practices. But what is God saying here? Do not do mixtures that had no business being mixed together. You need to understand the nature of wool, the nature of linen, the nature of an ox, the nature of a donkey, to understand what the purity of the vineyard was doing, and you're changing that purity for some reason that should never have been changed. Now, I can tell you how we're to interpret this. Because in chapter 25, verse 4, we have a similar verse, and in the New Testament it's very clear. Remember in Deuteronomy 25:4, we're going to get there, it says, you shall not muzzle out an ox while it treads out the grain. So when you had an ox going in a circle and it's pulling this big flat pan with metal in it, with holes in it, and as the grate goes over, they usually put rocks on top of it, and as it goes over the wheat, the bud and the chaff of the wheat will fall apart from each other, and then you can get the grain. And the ox would just go in a circle, and these things would pop out, and then you go and you collect it and put some more down. And so when those little grains pop off from the chaff, and the ox wants to stop and eat some of those grains to keep up its energy, don't put a muzzle on it. So some greedy guy put a muzzle on the ox so he tries to eat some of it, he can't. He's saying that's cruel. Don't do that. So the question is, man, God is really concerned about oxen, isn't he? And Paul says, no, not really. And this is what he tells us, quoting Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, in 1 Corinthians 9. He says this, for it's written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about, Paul asks. And the answer is, or does he say it altogether for our sakes? He's telling you the biblical interpretation has nothing to do with an ox. It's what is the message God's communicating that we are to interpret. For our sakes, no doubt this is written. And then he says that he who plows should plow in hope. He who threshes in hope should partake of his hope. If you have sown spiritual things, it is a great thing if we reap your material things. And he goes on to explain that a pastor should financially be supported by the church. And this is what God was really saying about don't put a muzzle on the ox. It really had to do with paying your spiritual leaders of the sustenance they need to financially support themselves, to continue to be able to do the spiritual duties they do as spiritual leaders. Wow. Wow. Would you have connected those two? Would you have read Deuteronomy 25:4 and go, oh, this is talking about spiritual leaders being paid? So in the same way, now we come back to this verse. And it's talking about these mixtures. And so I would say to you, is it God really concerned about the mixture of the vine? Is it really God concerned about the ox and the mule being, the donkey being burdened? Is it really about God concerned about your fabrics and your garments and when you mix them together? I would say no. It's about the mixture. And so we find in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 11 through 13, O Corinthians, we have spoken openly to you. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted by your own affections. Now in return for the same, I speak as to children, you also be open. So why am I oppressive to you, Paul says? Why does it seem that when you think about Apollos and Cephas and these other pastors, you're all excited about it, as you talked about back at the beginning of 1 Corinthians. But when you think about old Apostle Paul, you're like, I don't want to go hear him preach. I don't want to read his letter. Is it really me that's turning you off, or is it your heart of mixture? Is it your worldliness? Is it your linen because you're born again, but you're trying to infiltrate yourself with the wool of this world? And the two together are ripping and tearing each other apart. So he goes on in verse 14 of 2 Corinthians 6 to say this, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? He goes on to say in verse 15 to 18, and what accord has Christ with Belial, which is another word for Satan? Or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are a temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore come out from among them. Be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean. I will receive you. I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. And then it goes on into chapter 7. That's where this passage should have ended. In 2 Corinthians 7:1, therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from the filthiness of the flesh and of the spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. So what is he saying here? Don't you get it? You're an ox, they're a mule. You're linen, they're wool. There's two different characteristics going on there. You're this ox and you're plowing, and they're a mule. They're not another ox. Are you confused thinking they're another ox? So the ox has got his pace and the mule's got its pace. The ox is going straight. The mule's trying to turn. And so the ox is trying to fight against this mule, keeping up with him and turning, and he's not carrying his load. And yeah, the plowing's getting done, but it's not natural. In the same way, you're making this beautiful garment, but you don't understand. As soon as you wash it, as soon as you give a little sweat to it and time, you're going to see this beautiful garment become just a bunch of shreds of nothing because of the different patterns of shrinking, different characters. And so I sometimes have seen carnal Christians say, man, I would rather hang out with my non-Christian friends down at the bar. I tried to be a part of a Christian, whatever sporting group, basketball group or softball or baseball or volleyball, and they're just no fun. I hang out with my non-Christian team, and man, we're on the same page together. I've seen people, I've heard them out and out say, well, my non-Christian friends are much more honest than my Christian friends. My non-Christian friends are much more understanding than my Christian friends. My non-Christian friends are much more tolerant than my Christian friends. My first reaction to all of those is, you need to find different Christian friends because those don't sound like very good Christians. And usually they're going to some church that is sort of a a wishy-washy doctrinal church that really isn't very spiritually grounded, and it's sort of true what they're saying. These Christians that go to church really aren't getting fed to really live as Christians, and they are sort of a mixture of bad doctrine with good doctrine, and carnalness and worldliness and progressivism or whatever mixed together. And it isn't really pure Christianity that you're dealing with. So it's not, if you were with pure Christians, you wouldn't feel that way. But again, it's don't you understand? It's as obvious as if God were the ox and Satan was the mule. It's as opposite as if light and darkness are trying to make a fabric together. Don't you understand? The only answer to this is no more mixture. And whether you get your butt bit at the beginning or get your butt bit at the end, it's going to bite you. This cannot exist. It's impossible for this to exist. And there is a purity of linen that is without the filthiness of the flesh and of the spirit. And there is this linen that you can now perfect holiness in the fear of God. And so as we conclude tonight, as verse 11, this is as far as we're going to make it, we do understand that maybe this is what David was talking about. I've been meditating on this for a few weeks now, maybe even a couple of months. And I was pierced to the heart when I read this. And I just like, God, this is me. And it reminds me of that Psalm 139, verse 23 and 24 that I so love. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties. And see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way of everlasting. So, Lord, is there mixture in me that should not be there? Is there a ripping and tearing in my life because I am trying to mix light with darkness, Christ with Belial? I'm trying to be in an unnatural step along with an ox and a donkey when I need to get with another ox with an ox pulling together. Ah, how sweet, how pure. Two strong oxen with the same type of nature, with the same type of step, that are able to carry the same kind of burden together, walking together.